across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about a variety of different topics, as you might imagine. First off, we're going to be talking about a very good piece by Brian Kennedy, Why Attack Iran Now? He is the president of the American Strategy Group, and I would encourage you to print it out. It is our first article. First 5 pages really are about Iran. The last 2 are about China. I'll explain more about that in just a minute. Also, I've posted a piece about what happened to some of those reluctant allies. Some of that's changed over the last 24 hours, so we'll talk about whether or not we can clean up and clear the Straits of Hormuz. So we'll get into that soon enough. I decided eventually it's time to talk about Cesar Chavez. That is a topic that sometimes is worth a mention, and so we will get into that. We do have some other pieces by Star Parker, whole section about the Save America Act, and much more. And all of that will be the first hour. In the second hour, we have our good friend Dr. Gary Chapman, and he has a book out called The Love Language That Matters Most. He has written that with Les and Leslie Parrott, who've been on the program with us as well, and so I think this will be a very helpful book for you as well. But I thought we'd get into some of the very important issues, and there have been some that have said it would be helpful if this administration would make a better case for why we went into Iran. If you were to talk to everybody from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, to Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of War, whatever you want to call it, as well as the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and, of course, Donald Trump himself, they feel like they have. But sometimes you need to get into some of the background, and this piece by Brian Kennedy might be just one of the best. And so he starts out by saying, for almost a half a century, American policy makers have been conditioned to look the other way when Iran has attacked America. And he points out that the president had 2 objectives: one, to make sure Iran does not use nuclear ballistic missiles to attack the United States, and hopefully to install a regime favorable to U.S. interest. Even if the second doesn't happen, the first certainly seems like it is going to take place. And he reminds us that last summer's Operation Desert Hammer did not change the Iranian regime's mind that destroying America was their birthright. He talks about the fact that, as I've mentioned in one of my commentaries and also have mentioned in an upcoming article in Outlook, that 25 years ago, you've got to remember that the Iranian military tested its ability to launch a short-range ballistic missile from a freighter ship. Now, that one didn't have a nuclear warhead, but it illustrates what they could do if they were outside of the United States, even just along our shores. A nuclear warhead, he says, launched off of the U.S. coast and detonated in the atmosphere could permanently destroy our electronic infrastructure and lead to the death of millions of Americans. So this has been a concern for some time. The argument that they don't have long-range ballistic missiles is true, but it certainly does not understand the reality of what indeed could take place. And the Iranians have actually done quite a number of things. First of all, he points out they've worked continuously to modernize their ballistic missile system and also to develop their nuclear enrichment program. Now, again, some of the factors that we've talked about before, we've had, in a sense, a conflict with them for 47 years, going all the way back to 1979, when the militant students took control of the American embassy, 52 hostages there. Of course, I've pointed out many of the other attacks. One of the ones he talks about here is the attack by Hezbollah on the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, killing 241 American servicemen. But he goes on to say that for Iran, the United States is the great Satan, and they believe that we as a country do not have the courage and we don't have the moral conviction to defend ourselves against who they consider themselves to be morally superior mullahs there in Iran. And just as he said, an Iranian-supplied IED has been used to kill American soldiers, so their nuclear ambitions pose an existential threat to America's homeland. He also points out something that some people say, well, they're just trying to develop nuclear power. Iran sits on the second largest deposit of natural gas in the world. Page 4 is worth just reading alone because he points out that the production of nuclear power would be done at 5 times the cost, and there really is no reason why they need to develop nuclear power. So this argument that they were using this for peaceful means, of course, nothing. And he says to this day, the Iranians have children, and when they go to school each morning, they recite this: death to America and death to Israel. The Iranian Revolution 1979 may have been conducted almost a half a century ago, but it's alive in the hearts and minds of not only the leaders in Iran, those who are still left, but also the members of the RGC, as well as many of the population. And you might say, well, we have an opportunity to defend ourselves. But he points out that the president's Golden Dome missile defense system is still in its infancy. We cannot right now stop Russia or Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles. We do have mid-course defense systems in Fort Greely, Alaska, and in Vandenberg Space Force in California. But their primary function is to stop North Korean ballistic missiles, if they could even stop those. And so he goes on to then spend some time talking about how this particular issue could affect China and the fact that we have about 200,000 Chinese men of military age that seem to have come into this country illegally. And that suggests that we have some issues to address apart from Iran. But that brings me to my second article, because yesterday you heard me mention, at least in the second hour, that we had a number of allies like Germany and others said, look, we don't have any need to defend what's going on. We don't have to worry about what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz because we didn't start this military action, so why should we be involved? Which led for the president on Truth Social to say, I wonder what would happen if we finished off what's left of the Iranian terror state and then let the countries that use it, we don't, be responsible for the so-called Strait of Hormuz. That would get some of our non-responsive allies in gear and fast. Well, that rather blunt warning at least got a response from the NATO Secretary, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who actually has been somewhat of a supporter of Donald Trump, said, I've been in contact with many allies. The Strait of Hormuz has to be open. We all agree the strait has to be open again. And what I know is the allies are working together, discussing how to do that and what is the best way to do it. We're working on that collectively to find a way ahead. And I might just also mention the United Arab Emirates also has dedicated themselves to helping make sure that they can protect the shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. So something rather dramatic seems to have happened in the last 24 hours, and that's a good thing because there are many countries that do depend on the oil. Almost 20% of the oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll spend some time a little bit later talking about that from a very good piece written by Star Parker, Freedom is Not Free. And then we'll get into, of course, the Save America Act, the ongoing debate in the Senate, and much more. When we come back, though, I want to make some comments about Cesar Chavez because of this investigative report from the New York Times. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In previous commentaries, I've talked about the declining birth rates in most developed countries. People are not having as many children as they used to. John Goodman explains why there is a birth dearth. First, there is the opportunity cost of motherhood. He explains that for most of the 20th century, a typical woman aspired to be a housewife and mother. In the interim, she chose occupations that accommodated her husband's career. Teaching, nursing, and secretarial work, for example, are in demand almost everywhere. In the modern era, women have more opportunities and have entered such fields as medicine, law, business, and STEM in large numbers. Second is the cost of raising children. For most of human history, children could be thought of as an investment that was moderately profitable for families. But in the last century, the transfer of wealth from children to parents reversed. At the same time, parents have the desire to see their children do well in life, which causes them to focus on competition with other children. And this led to a third reason, the cost of childhood competition. We compete for scarce resources such as city apartments, concert tickets, or seats at sporting events. Many of the things we compete for involve children, scholarships, and admission to elite schools and universities. Those at the top of the income ladder can provide more than those further down the income ladder. And a final reason is government regulations that have a negative impact on the affordability of children. For example, rising housing costs since 1990 are responsible for 11% fewer children. Government has made childbearing more expensive. These are some of the reasons for the birth dearth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I thought I'd take a few minutes just to talk about the issue of Cesar Chavez, if for no other reason than it's in the news right now. If you're like me, you're probably watching the news, and all of a sudden they're bringing out all sorts of stories about the sexual issues of Cesar Chavez. I recognize since it's a family-oriented show, I won't get into the details, but imagine the worst, and that's where we are. And I thought, why now? In some respects, those of us growing up in California had heard some things about him in terms of groups that he worked with and things he might have done, but nevertheless, this New York Times very significant bombshell investigative report, I would be inclined to read some of it, but again, I'll be careful because, again, it's pretty salacious. And if you think about this, probably the highest profile icon in at least the American labor movement in our recent time, maybe go all the way back to the beginning of the AFL-CIO or something like that, but in the recent history has certainly been Cesar Chavez. And if you don't believe that, just travel around the country with me, because the best estimates are there are more than 100 places in the United States that have his name. We have streets named for him. We have libraries named for him. We have elementary school, middle school, high schools named for him. We have colleges, Cesar Chavez College, for example, and campuses. We're talking about Berkeley and Denver and Las Vegas and Modesto and Oakland and Sacramento and San Diego and Seattle. For those of you in California, you know that at the end of this month is a state holiday, the birthday of Cesar Chavez. Okay, so now when you have this New York Times story coming out about him being, and I think I'll try to use careful words here, a serial sexual abuser of women and teenage girls, you can see that ever since he's died since 1993, he was significant when he was alive, in some respects more significant even now. If you, again, for our listeners in California, go to his home or to his grave, those are national monuments. And the U.S. Park Service, for example, recognizes and writes that he was widely recognized as the most important Latino leader in the United States during the 20th century. Now, up until now, you might say, okay, New York Times, should I really believe the New York Times? Well, of course, the reason the New York Times came out is with a number of women that have come forward and others who have kept this secret, who once the story came out said, I've never wanted to say anything because I did not want to hurt the movement. But yes, and this happened to me too. So we'll go through some of that, and I'll be careful. But for example, in the New York Times, you have the story of Ana Murguia and how she was sexually abused. Deborah Rosas is another one there. By the way, Deborah Rosas first was sexually assaulted by him when she was 12. Later arranged to have her stay in a motel when she was 15. You can fill it in. I mean, we're talking Jeffrey Epstein kinds of things in terms of what he did. And so then after the Times story has come out, you have another civil rights leader, Dolores Huerta, who talks about, I'm nearly 96 96 years of old, and for the last 60 years I've kept the secret. But her secret's even more significant because each time he was sexually involved with her, she became pregnant. And she points out in this piece of her statement, both sexual encounters with Cesar Chavez led to pregnancy. I chose to keep my pregnancy secret, and after the children were born, I arranged for them to be raised by other families that could give them stable lives. Okay, that's what we know so far. You know as well as I do that where there's smoke, there's fire. When some of the dominoes begin to drop, others drop, and I suspect we're on just the front end of maybe some other revelations, although recognizing that Dolores Huerta is 96 years old, so some of the people who may indeed have been abused are no longer alive to even talk about it. But there we go. What I think needs to happen next will be interesting to watch. First of all, the Cesar Chavez Foundation has $40 million in revenue, at least that's as recent as 2024. They have $226 million in assets. Now, the foundation did issue a statement. We are deeply shocked and saddened by what we're hearing, but you've got to wonder how long they're going to keep calling it the Cesar Chavez Foundation. But do you think they're going to divest themselves of that money? Well, you know better than that. And I think it just illustrates again that there are going to have to be some changes, not just the changes to the names of colleges and streets and other things, but Jim Garrity, writing about this, said, if you went to the school in the 1980s or later, there's a good chance you saw a picture of Cesar Chavez in one of the later chapters in your history book. Yeah, probably do. I've seen pictures of him in many places. Haven't even gotten to the presidents yet, but we'll get to that in just a minute. And, of course, the U.S. Department of Labor has him in their Hall of Honor. I think they may take that down. His jacket, if you go to the Smithsonian, is there in the National Museum of American History. And, of course, you've had at least one film and movie about him, so certainly the case. Well, let's talk about a few of the presidents, because it has been almost required of Democratic candidates and presidents to have honored Cesar Chavez, understandably so. And certainly President Bill Clinton, after he died, that is, after Cesar Chavez died, said, "We can be proud of his enormous accomplishments and dignity and comfort he brought to the lives of so many of our country's least powerful and most dispossessed workers. He had a profound impact on the people of America." Bill Clinton, at the time when he was president, posthumously awarded Cesar Chavez the Medal of Freedom. Okay, let's fast forward to 2012. President Barack Obama traveled to Keene, California to dedicate the national monument, which I just mentioned a minute ago. And he talked about the fact that more than higher wages or better working conditions, this was Caesar's gift to us, a reminder that we're all God's children, that every life has value. He believed that when a child anywhere in America can dream beyond her circumstances and work to realize that dream, it makes all our futures a little bit better. And then he proclaimed, as you might remember, that March 31st, 2014 would be Cesar Chavez Day, and goes into some of the things of which he was a champion of social justice. And then upon taking office, President Joe Biden, another Democratic president, chose to display a bust of Cesar Chavez in the Oval Office. Said, "When I became president, I proudly placed a bust of Cesar Chavez in the Oval to serve as a reminder of the values he embodied, a vision of freedom he fought for, and his commitment to justice and dignity we must uphold each and every day." Now, the fact that I just mentioned those three presidents, did any of them know about his sexual abuses? Probably not. Did some people? Yes, somebody was covering up quite a bit, as we now are finding out. And I just think, again, for those looking at the issue of immigration, we've had some people on this program point out that Cesar Chavez actually was a person who believed in strong borders and restricting illegal immigration, because he saw how illegal immigrants competing with those who were native-born could actually drive down wages and hurt them. And there's some incredible stories about Cesar Chavez yelling at people, shouting matches, accusing people of being agents of the communists or the Republicans. And, maybe some of the paranoia was justifiable because the FBI was at that time investigating various people, and we've seen that before. But again, one of the reasons many of the people remain silent is because they didn't want to hurt the cause that he led. And I think we can recognize two things can be true. He did stand for worker rights, and he was concerned about those individuals that were out there in the farms and farm workers. And the other hand had a sexual history that is pretty obnoxious and overwhelming, quite frankly. And again, we've seen this phenomenon, haven't we? You know, priests abusing individuals. Well, we don't want to bring that up because it might hurt the Catholic Church. Individuals that say the president was maybe sexually harassing individuals, but we don't want to bring that up because, after all, that might lead to all sorts of lawsuits and might hurt the brand, and on and on and on. There are, I think, a reason to understand that many of these individuals that have been put on a pedestal, we're starting to find out once again, maybe they, like all of us, had a sin nature, but some of them were perhaps more depraved than we were led to believe. And so, 3 cheers for the New York Times to have the courage to address an individual who's been kind of an icon for the left, but nevertheless point out, if we're really serious about dealing with sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and the like, the story needs to be told. So just thought I'd bring that up. If you start noticing that some of your local communities are taking down the name of Cesar Chavez, there's a very good reason for it, and it all goes back to this story and now follow-up stories from the New York Times. We'll be right back.
Data reveals that more Americans are interested in reading the Bible again, but they also have difficulty applying what they read to contemporary issues. That's because most Americans don't actually hold a biblical worldview, even if they identify as Christians. A biblical worldview understands that the Bible holds the truth, and that truth illuminates every part of life, including every current problem that we worry about today. Point of View's Truth Team has helped Americans make sense of complicated contemporary issues in light of biblical truth for over 50 years. And next week, starting March 23rd, Point of View will be highlighting the impact that you can have when you join the Truth Team. Help Americans find truth and live by it. Learn more by visiting pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, one of the things we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is encouraging you to contact your 2 senators about the SAVE Act. Of course, you also have what is called the Save America Act, and there have been various iterations of this. But I post 2 articles for you to see that this is going to be and has always been an uphill battle, and I don't know that we will see any final resolution, but if nothing else, the first article I have here is from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. And they said, for partisan hype, it's hard to beat the Senate debate this week on the Save America Act. President Trump says the legislation is a salvation from mass voter fraud. Senator Chuck Schumer says it's an effort at mass voter suppression, Jim Crow 2.0. They say neither is a reality. Also, Republicans don't have the votes to clear the Senate filibuster, and if they bully the bill through anyway, Democrats eyeing the end of a 60-vote rule will quietly celebrate. Now, the point they're making is simply this. if you look at the SAVE Act, it was pretty straightforward, and that is registering people to vote. They had to show some form of citizenship. That could be a passport. It could be a birth certificate. It could be a naturalization document or other things like that. But because in some states driver's licenses are given to non-citizens, understandably, a driver's license would not qualify, but it would accept a so-called real ID, which indicates that applicant is a citizen, but in some cases that's a problem with a few states. But that could be resolved. And that was the first thing. And then, of course, the second is that that would be, first of all, that you would actually have to be a citizen to register. And then number two, have to show an ID before you vote. Now, that's not that complicated. If you were absolutely convinced that that was onerous, and I'm not convinced that it is, most people have access to some document. If they don't have a birth certificate, it's not hard to get. But again, this would only be for people that were going to newly register. So yes, it's going to affect an 18-year-old who probably has his or her birth certificate. Of course, a lot of individuals, of course, have driver's licenses that are part of what are called real ID driver's licenses, or might even have a passport or whatever. But okay, I recognize that could be a bit of a hill, but asking to show a photo ID before your vote is really not asking for too much. But this is where the editors of Wall Street Journal say, yes, but some of these enhanced driver's licenses that are supposed to show citizenship haven't been distributed effectively. Okay, that's a problem that could find a solution by the time we have the next election, but okay, I recognize that. But the other requirement of showing ID before you vote, as you've heard everybody say, you have to show your driver's license if you check in at a hotel, if you buy alcohol, if you go into a government building. Of course, the one we all love to laugh about is you have to show two IDs as well as a Social Security card to shovel snow in New York City, and on and on and on. We've all heard it before. And again, this could be a military card, it could be a tribal card, it could be a state card, it could be a variety of different things. And so that was pretty small in terms of the so-called SAVE Act. Then there was a desire to expand the SAVE Act to called the Save America Act. And this would then also prevent states from mail-in voting. The problem with you have there, first of all, is the Constitution, because most elections, by the way, are run by the state. A federal election, okay, I can see that. And so that is the case. And so that would be difficult for people if you didn't allow for at least some kind of rigorous absentee balloting for people that are sick, disabled, serving in the military, traveling. But again, there are some ways around that. And once you added that and then one more, because then they decided, well, this is sort of a must-pass piece of legislation. And sometimes when you have a must-pass piece of legislation like the reauthorization of the Defense Department, sometimes other things are added to it. And they thought, well, let's add to it the whole transgender issue as well. And after a while, you begin to see it's going to be a little bit more difficult to make this work. And in order to pass this, that brings us to the other thing that the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, and that is there are not enough votes. Certainly, it's hard enough to find enough votes amongst the Republicans for this. It is really hard to find Democrats. John Fetterman, who I thought might have been one that would be a Democrat voting for it, the other day expressed his concern. So I thought, okay, you have none. So you have to get 51 Senate votes. That'd have to be 51 Republicans, probably. And if indeed, then they point out next time Democrats could use 51 votes in the Senate to mandate ballot harvesting or to ban voter ID, and could also use 51 votes to make new states out of Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, on and on. I mean, again, you can see the possible dangers, but nevertheless, that I think illustrates why we're dealing with this issue and why something which at its face seems so simple, after all, more than 80% of most Americans think it was certainly wise and is a good idea to actually request somebody to show a photo ID before they vote. Even if they don't always ask for it, the fact that you know somebody might ask for it, I think, is sometimes enough of a deterrent. But that's the piece that comes from the Wall Street Journal, and I think you are seeing why sometimes even some Republicans are saying, I'm not so sure about, I'm sure about the SAVE Act, but I'm not so sure about the Save America Act, and that is certainly something that's not going to pass, which leads to Mark Crookston, who wrote, Election Reform Republicans Can Actually Pass, because he points out that obviously there was an attempt to try to prevent fraud, requiring a voter ID for federal elections, requiring a proof of citizenship in order to register, banning mail-in ballots, requiring states to purge their voter rolls of ineligible voters. But the more you add to that, the more difficult it looks to get it passed, even by Republican votes, much less Democratic votes. And as a result, he says maybe what we should do is do the math and recognize that, yes, you do have an opportunity to do something, but let's recognize that when Republicans hold a narrow 53-47 advantage in the Senate, it's first of all not enough to clear the 60 vote requirement, but it's maybe even difficult with all the various things that have added to the Save America Act to even get 51 votes if you were to get rid of the filibuster. So as much as people are saying, I'm furious with these rhinos that are in the Senate, and you certainly have somebody who agrees with that around the table here as well, that is also the problem of maybe trying to get too much too quickly. And so he says, first of all, there's a lot to like about the Save America Act, but the narrow margins in the Senate make it difficult for it to become law. To overcome this issue, the Senate should pass voter ID on its own. This approach might not accomplish as much as the currently structured SAVE Act, but victory is sometimes achieved in steps rather than leaps. Republicans would be wise to win small rather than lose big. And I guarantee you, if you had to get an up or down vote on whether or not you just had to show an ID before you vote, I think at this point it would be a little tougher to see a few Democrats willing to go and die on that hill that Chuck Schumer has created, saying it's Jim Crow 2.0 because we're requiring you to show a photo ID, given the fact that most red states require that, even some blue states do. I think that up or down vote would be helpful, one, because I think you might get the requisite number of votes. Number two, quite possibly, for those who didn't vote for it, this could be a really big election issue. And if you haven't noticed, we're in the midst of the midterms. So Matt Crookston is recognizing that maybe we can't get everything at once. Sometimes politics is about what you can get. If you can get half a loaf, it's better than no loaf at all. And so his argument is that maybe the best we can do at the moment would still be something, and that is to work to ensure election integrity by at least requiring a voter ID for everybody that votes. And that would be at least one step in the right direction, which we desperately need, since every other state that we've mentioned or country that has done this has not seen that it leads to voter suppression. It actually, in many cases, leads to increased voter participation. And as I said, other countries, almost all the European countries, require an ID before you vote. As we oftentimes hear our progressive friends say, why can't we be more like Europe? Well, if we want to be more like Europe, we would require somebody to show an ID before they vote. Anyway, that gives you an idea of where this battle is taking place. I'm sure tomorrow we'll talk about it in our Friday weekend edition. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
I began the program today by quoting from Brian Kennedy's piece, Why Attack Iran Now? A very good piece, which I think really sets forth in 5 pages why, indeed, we are involved in this military engagement in Iran. And then the last 2 pages deal with China, which we'll get to in the future. A lot of that we'll probably cover tomorrow when we have Jeff Mateer and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. But I thought we'd come back to the issue from a piece by Star Parker, which has the title, Freedom is Not Free. And she reminds us back in the height of the energy crisis in the 1970s, Economist magazine showed a map of the Persian Gulf on the cover with the headline, What's a Nice Thing Like Oil Doing in a Place Like That? Because we were very aware in the 1970s, those of us who were alive, that we were already facing kind of an energy crisis there. There was an oil embargo. It was the beginning of OPEC. There were many of the countries that were maybe not as favorable to the United States. And why is it all the oil is in the Middle East? Well, now you're starting to find that through fracking and other kinds of exploration, we are very benefited by the fact that we have, in terms of natural gas and oil, quite a bit in this country. But it's a reminder that we've always had to pay attention to the Middle East in part because of oil. And so she goes on to say, by impeding the movement of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil supplies pass, that is, the Iranian leadership, what's left of them, know they can hit the American people at the gas pump and start them screaming for President Donald Trump to pull out of the war. And she says, I felt it the other day. She lives in California, where she shelled out $150 to fill a tank. I can't even imagine. And she says eventually people are going to be screaming that the price of gas is too high. And so the one thing that she says is that weak leaders govern by polls, not by principle. Their finger is always to the wind, trying to determine what will make voters happy tomorrow. They seek ways that government can ease the pain. And she takes us back to the energy crisis of the 1970s. I lived through that. Some of you that are older did as well, in which you had Jimmy Carter concerned about the energy market. So what was his solution? Well, same one that Richard Nixon used, both of which were wrong, price controls. And so then you had government programs that were developed to develop alternative energy sources. Does that sound familiar? Created the Department of Energy, which was created under him, in many cases made things worse. When Ronald Reagan was voted in, she reminds us that Reagan immediately removed government interventions and the price of oil plummeted by almost a factor of 6. So if nothing else, sometimes you just need to do the right thing. And sometimes when you do the right thing, the price goes down, but sometimes it doesn't. Now, one of the questions that people have always had is, well, it seems like we've been dealing with this idea of a nuclear Iran for a long time. And she points out in the bottom of her second page commentary that the pursuit by the Iranian terrorist regime for nuclear weapons goes all the way back to 2002. And that was really just about the same year after the attacks on 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Those, of course, attacks came about because we weren't necessarily paying attention to the fact that many of these Muslim terrorists were attacking us. President Clinton at one point did launch some missiles into Libya, into Afghanistan, but a lot of the things that created the 9/11 disaster were happening under his watch. And as a matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal, she says, documents the ongoing Iranian activity to enrich uranium and develop weapons since 2002, despite some of the efforts of many of the presidents. You have President Barack Obama, then you had Donald Trump, and then Joe Biden. But interestingly enough, Donald Trump wanted the sanctions, but the easing of the sanctions came from Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Sanctions you had with George W. Bush. It's sort of up, down, up, down. If you look at Bush, then Obama, then later Trump, and then Biden, you see that is the case. And I think there was always the idea that, well, maybe we can buy them off. And yet the evidence seems to be very clearly that what happened is when we eased those sanctions, the Iranian rulers gained hundreds of billions of dollars from their oil exports, which they used to fund terrorism against us. And of course, one example she points out is October 7th, 2023, which was, of course, the attack by Hamas on Israel. So she says, freedom is not free. No, it's not. And I've got a commentary coming out next week just to remind us that there is a cost to war, and sometimes people aren't willing to talk about that. But let's mention it for just a minute, because we are getting into now almost the third week of military engagement in Iran. And some people say, well, what's it costing us? And the cost in lives hasn't been great, but any loss of any life in a war is a tragedy. But if you look at some of the war games that were done by the Defense Department, they were expecting, if indeed we ever did go into Iran, that there would be a great loss of life and military hardware. And despite what some of the mainstream media says, quite frankly, this has been a relatively successful or a very successful military engagement, depending on your perspective. But what are the costs? It's been more than $1 billion a day. I mean, the first 12 days, it was $16 billion. And so we spend more than $1 billion every single day. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, was asked about that. And he said, well, there's no price tag that will make the Iran war unaffordable. Okay, on the one hand, you could say, well, you could argue that putting a price tag on trying to bring peace to the Middle East, you really can't put a price tag on that. But on the other hand, you have to say it seems to be the idea of the government that at a time when we're, 38 and almost $39 trillion in national debt, well, we'll just have to crank up the money printers. And if that is the case, you know what that's going to mean. And that could be really of concern. Even last month, just to give you a perspective on that, we brought in $313 billion into the federal treasury. That's a lot. That's from taxes and revenue and tariffs and all that. $313 billion. The problem is we spent $621 billion. So that's a $38 billion deficit just in 1 month. The deficit over the last 6 months has been $1 trillion. So politicians may not want to talk about costs, but sooner or later, we either pay for it with increased taxes, or more likely, since the taxes aren't going up because of the so-called big, beautiful bill, we pay for it in inflation. You can't print more and more money that you don't have to fund a war overseas and not expect it not to have an impact. So that is the cost. And so that is, I think, another aspect of this column by Star Parker. Freedom is not free, and that is true. And we need to stand for principles. We need to protect the American homeland. But at the same time, we need to start asking, how are we going to pay for all this? And when the argument is there's no price tag that will make the Iraq war unaffordable, got to be a little bit concerned about that. And maybe it's the kind of question that you should ask some of your members of Congress, because while they're debating whether or not to pass the SAVE Act or the Save America Act, they're going to just continue kicking the can down the road about trying to pay for everything that we're actually having the federal government do. That's a very significant part, and it's the other side of that coin. Safety and security on one side, the financial obligations on the other. We'll talk about both of those here on Point of View. We come back, though, what we're going to talk about is the love languages that matter most. I think you'll really appreciate Dr. Gary Chapman. Just a delightful individual, a fun interview, and we'll spend some time helping you to be a more loving person. All that coming up right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
I've been looking forward to this interview for some time, and it has to do with the good conversations we always have with Dr. Gary Chapman. Of course, we're going to be talking about the 5 love languages, and it's interesting that that has had such an impact that I can come up to somebody and say, have you ever heard of the 5 love languages? And they say, oh, sure, words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, physical touch. I mean, this has really made an impact, but you might think, is there more to say? Well, yes, there is, and that's why we're going to be talking about this new book, The Love Language That Matters Most, How to Personalize Love So They Really Feel It. And that comes from Dr. Gary Chapman, but also from Les and Leslie Parrott, who've been on the program with us as well. Again, if you are not familiar, Dr. Gary Chapman is an author, a speaker, pastor, and a counselor, probably a very well-known marriage counselor, and best known, of course, for many of the 5 love language books in the series. We even have a link to 5lovelanguages.com on our website. These books have been selling over about 20 million copies, translated into about 50 different languages. His nationally syndicated radio programs air on the Moody Broadcasting Network and affiliate programs and all the rest. So, Dr. Gary Chapman, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Kerby. Good to be back with you.
Let's again talk about pairing with Les and Leslie Parrott. We saw you the other day on TBN, and in some respects, that is bringing another couple to the conversation. And between the two of you, this is quite the book.
Well, I'm really excited about it, and I turned to Les and Leslie to help me on this because I really have admired them through the years. And, you know, he's a psychologist, Christian psychologist, and he's really good on assessments. And so he made an assessment, a premier assessment on the 5 love languages, giving you a lot more information than we could on that little free quiz that we've had up there for years. So I'm really excited about this book.
I might just mention, too, that we'll get to the premium assessment, and we have information about your book. Again, I think most anybody can find it in their local bookstore, but we do have a link so that as you click on the picture there of Gary Chapman and go down, you'll see the book there as well. Came out in January. And, of course, you can get it in paperback or Kindle, and I think you will find it probably in your bookstore, but if not, it is right there. But let's go back for people that are maybe hearing some of this for the first time, because your first chapter talks about lost in translation. And when people say, I love you, because we have, if you will, different love languages, what you think might be portraying love to an individual. This could be a spouse, this could be your children, it could be a friend, whatever it might be. It may be received differently, and so in some respects, it's lost in translation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'll never forget the first time it dawned on me many years ago that what makes one person feel loved doesn't make another person feel loved. The wife said in the counseling office, she said, here's the problem. I just don't feel any love coming from him. We don't fight. We're civil, but he does his thing. I do my thing. We're just like roommates living in the same house. And I don't know how long I can go on like this. And I looked at her husband, and he said, I don't understand her. I do everything I can to show her that I love her. I don't know what else I can do. And I said to him, well, what do you do? He said, well, I get home from work before she does. I start the evening meal. Some nights I have it ready before she gets there. If not, she'll help me. Afterwards, I wash the dishes every night. I vacuum the floors on Thursday night. Saturday, I wash the car. I mow the grass. I help her with the laundry. And he went on. And I was beginning to ask myself, what does this woman do? It sounded to me like he was doing everything. And he said, I don't know what else I can do. I looked back at her, and she started crying. And she said, he's right. He is a hard-working man, and I appreciate all those things he does. But we don't ever talk. We haven't talked in 20 years. He's always mowing the grass, washing the dishes, vacuuming the floors. And I realized here was a sincere husband who was loving his wife in the best way he knew how.
That's right.
But it wasn't connecting with her emotionally. And since then, of course, I heard many stories similar to that, which led me many years ago now to say there's got to be a reason for this. And so I went back and read notes that I had written when I was counseling and asked myself, when someone said, I feel like my spouse doesn't love me, what did they want? What were they complaining about? And the answers fell into 5 categories, and I later called them the 5 love languages and started using it in my counseling. If you want her to feel loved, you've got to learn to speak your love in her language. And if you want him to feel loved, you've got to learn to speak his love language. And it was probably 5 years after that I thought, if I could put this in a book and write it in the language of the common person, leave out psychological terms that many people would not understand, maybe I could help a lot of couples I would never have time to see in my office. Of course, I had no idea what you mentioned earlier. It would sell over 20 million copies and be published in over 50 languages around the world. So,
just incredible.
Yeah.
Let me just, if I can, say that what that creates is what you call a love deficit. And that's important because, as you said, there are individuals that are working sometimes very hard, others maybe not as hard, to try to show love. But if it's not being received with the right receptacle, you end up with kind of a love tank that's getting empty, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned earlier they're applying to the children. I say to parents, the question is not, do you love your children? The question is, do your children feel loved? Because parents can be, we love our children by nature, but that doesn't mean they feel loved. I remember a 13-year-old young man had run away from home and ended up in my office. And in the course of our conversation, he said, my parents don't love me. They love my brother, but they don't love me. I knew his parents. I knew they loved him. The problem is they had never discovered that he had a language different from his brother. And consequently, he wasn't feeling loved. So, yeah, that's why I think that book has been so helpful, because almost everyone agrees one of our deepest emotional needs on the human level is the need to feel loved by the significant people in our lives. And if you're married, that's your spouse,
For sure.
In the first place.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, one of the things you talk about is this low love tank and the mystery of it. I'd never really picked up on the fact that it is easy to drain it and it's harder to fill it, and there's some very important aspects of that, which are part of this first section of the book. Then we're going to get into, of course, some other aspects of the problem, and then the solution, and then we're going to break down the tactics for all 5 of those. And again, this is part of the new book that just came out the last couple of months, The Love Language That Matters Most, How to Personally Love So That They Really Feel It. And of course, you've already heard from Dr. Gary Chapman, but I might just mention the doctors Les and Leslie Parrott are psychologists. They've had some best-selling books, Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. I meant to grab one of those off of our shelf that just to hold that up along with Gary Chapman's book for those of you watching online. But when we come back, we'll get into this whole idea of a love tank and how, in some respects, it can drain pretty easily. It takes a little bit more work to fill it up. And then listening between the lines of love. We've got all sorts of things to talk about. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In previous commentaries, I've talked about the declining birth rates in most developed countries. People are not having as many children as they used to. John Goodman explains why there is a birth dearth. First, there is the opportunity cost of motherhood. He explains that for most of the 20th century, a typical woman aspired to be a housewife and mother. In the interim, she chose occupations that accommodated her husband's career. Teaching, nursing, and secretarial work, for example, are in demand almost everywhere. In the modern era, women have more opportunities and have entered such fields as medicine, law, business, and STEM in large numbers. Second is the cost of raising children. For most of human history, children could be thought of as an investment that was moderately profitable for families. But in the last century, the transfer of wealth from children to parents reversed. At the same time, parents have the desire to see their children do well in life, which causes them to focus on competition with other children. And this led to a third reason, the cost of childhood competition. We compete for scarce resources such as city apartments, concert tickets, or seats at sporting events. Many of the things we compete for involve children, scholarships, and admission to elite schools and universities. Those at the top of the income ladder can provide more than those further. The government has made childbearing more expensive. These are some of the reasons for the birth dearth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we continue our conversation today with Dr. Gary Chapman, the love language that matters most, how to personalize love so they really feel it. And Dr. Chapman, for just a minute, let's say we can talk about this idea of a love tank. Everybody has a love tank, and when it's full, we feel really affirmed and encouraged and energized. But you also point out that it drains faster than it fills. And one of the researchers, Dr. John Gottman at the University of Washington, we've quoted him before, points out that there are certain things that can drain it very quickly. But help us out with that, because if we're going to be talking about love, we have to recognize that many people walking around with love tanks that are empty or nearly empty, aren't they?
You're exactly right. And I think in a marriage, if the love tank is empty over a long period of time, you're far more tempted to get involved with somebody else, thinking, oh, this is not going to work. I'm going to go over here. And it's tragic because you're going to have an empty love tank over there, too, after a few years when you come down off that in-love experience. So I think, and of course what Dr. Gottman said is, when you have one negative experience with your spouse, like you say hard words, angry words, with them, it takes 5 positive things to make up for that one negative thing. That's why we conclude that the emptying of the tank is much faster than the filling of the tank. But, if you know each other's primary love language, then you can keep the love tank full along the way and check in with each other every once in a while, and just say, honey, on a scale of 0 to 10, how full is your love tank today? If they say anything less than 10, you say, well, what could I do today that would fill it up? And they'll tell you. And it may not even be their primary love language on that particular day. It's circumstances. There may be another love language. But you know what? If you get the concept, you plug into each other periodically, just checking out with each other, which says, I really care. I want you to know that I care about you. You keep the love tank full. And everything else in life is easier if your love tank is full.
Well, again, you have a whole section there on how to gauge that. But one more problem before we get into the solutions, and that is the number one challenge for becoming, as you will, multilingual in love, because if indeed there are 5 love languages, your 5 are different than your spouse's or your friends' or your children's 5. And so in some respects, there's some very significant challenges because if nothing else, everybody has an agenda, and sometimes your agenda might actually be sabotaging your love life.
Yeah, even if you know the other person's love language, we all have an agenda every single day. Whether we're working in the home or out of the home, we have an agenda. And we get so caught up in whatever that is on a particular day that we sometimes just forget, wait a minute, how about our relationship? We had just assumed that the relationship is going to be okay. No, if we drift apart. We got to put the oars in the water if we're going to stay together and be moving in a positive direction. So that's why I think understanding the love language concept and then choosing, because love doesn't begin with a feeling. I mean, in love begins with a feeling, that experience. But the long-term love doesn't begin with a feeling. It begins with an attitude. And the attitude is, I want to enrich your life. I want to do everything I can to help you become the person that you believe God wants you to become. That's the attitude of love. Love language gives you information on how to meet one of those needs that person has, and that is their need for emotional love. And it's one of the biggest emotional needs that they have.
Wow. One of the things you talk about is cultivate curiosity. I think of in 1 Peter, for example, it says, husbands, to live with your wives in an understanding way. And it's the idea that husbands really need to be curious and understand their wives. And likewise, I think wives should understand their husbands and parents should understand their kids. But you also, real quickly, I thought I'd just mention, you also have a section there on build a boundary, because that's another part. It may not be your agenda. It's just there are so many distractions, Dr. Chapman, today, that it is really harder and harder to really cultivate and develop a good relationship because there are so many of these digital distractions, aren't there?
Well, you're absolutely right. And that's why I think we have to come back and remind ourselves life's meaning is not found in things. It's found in relationships. First of all, with God. Then if you're married, with your spouse. If you have children, with your children. And so it's a matter of thinking through, how am I investing my time and my energy? And we can get so caught up in this pursuit or that pursuit, and as you say, things on the online that distract us or maybe inform us or maybe entertain us. But if that's taking away from the time and the effort that we need to be investing in loving the other person, then that is a distraction rather than a help in the long run.
We can talk about solutions, and one of those is listening between the lines of love, and that is to recognize that if you are using what you call a third ear, you can be listening to the words of affirmation or quality time or receiving gifts or acts of service or physical touch, because you can see sometimes what they say, and it sometimes isn't what they say, it's what they don't say or what's in between the lines, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why we have to continue to ask questions, which is a way of expressing curiosity. Whatever your spouse says, if you can say, tell me more about that. That sounds interesting. Or I'd like to learn more about what you're thinking on that, rather than giving them an answer. Sometimes a wife or a husband may say to their spouse, I had a hard day today at work. And the other one say, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, that's the end of the conversation. But if you say, tell me about it, honey, what happened? And they start telling you, and then you say, well, how about this? Or how about that? You just keep asking questions. And then they realize they really care. They're here for me. They're identifying with me in my hard day that I had. So, learning how to ask questions and have communication, because we can't read each other's mind. But if we ask questions, our spouse will talk. They will share whatever it is that's on their mind that particular day and how they're feeling, how much love they're feeling or not feeling. So I think that's where curiosity and asking questions is so important in a growing relationship.
Just have to work to be a good listener and really, in a sense, always listening. But one more point before we take a break is loving with your head as well as your heart, because in some respects you use your head to analyze some of the facts and information that you get. You also need to be sympathizing with your heart. And then ultimately you talk about empathizing with your head and heart. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think bringing those two together, the head and the heart, intellectually, obviously the head has to be involved because we're listening to the facts of whatever they're telling us from their perspective. But empathy is really identifying with where they are emotionally as well as the factual things they're sharing. You're trying to really see the world through their eyes so that you can honestly say, after you've listened and asked questions, Honey, I can see how you would feel that way. That makes sense to me. Man, if I were in your place, I'd probably feel the same way. Now then, they may ask, what do you think I should do? Well, if they're asking advice, surely you can give them your advice. But sometimes we're giving advice before they even feel heard by us. And that's where they feel like, oh, they don't even know me. They're not interested. They just want to get through with this conversation.
Yeah, and again, men are probably more guilty of that, trying to give answers before they've always heard the questions and the issues. But let's take a break, and when we come back, I do want to talk about how personality colors the conversation. Introverts, extroverts. We've got a representative sample of both in our own ministry here, but certainly you have talked about how they are affecting that. And then we're going to get into all the tactics, 5 chapters on the 5 different love languages. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more. Of course, they've had that free gift survey, but this is going to be something more significant. That quiz was helpful, but now they have a love language premium assessment. So before we're done, we're going to talk about that. And of course, you can find out more about that by clicking on the buttons. If you look at the picture of Gary Chapman, you will see that will take you to 5 love languages. That's the number 5, lovelanguages.com. As you go there, of course, you can get a copy of the book, and as you see that, you will see all sorts of resources that are available there. There's a premium assessment, there's some books, there's all sorts of special editions, there are other resources. As a matter of fact, I might just mention, since we broadcast all over the United States, there are events, some of them coming up in places where we broadcast, so it's quite possible you could go and hear him speak, or some of the other individuals involved with him. So let's again encourage you to go to the website at pointofview.net. And we're talking about this book, The 5 Love Languages That Matter Most, How to Personalize Love So That They Really Feel It. We'll come back and talk about how personalities affect that, and then the 5 love languages right after this.
Data reveals that more Americans are interested in reading the Bible again, but they also have difficulty applying what they read to contemporary issues. That's because most Americans don't actually hold a biblical worldview, even if they identify as Christians. A biblical worldview understands that the Bible holds the truth, and that truth illuminates every area of life, including every current problem that we worry about today. Point of View's Truth Team has helped Americans make sense of complicated contemporary issues in light of biblical truth for over 50 years. And next week, starting March 23rd, Point of View will be highlighting the impact that you can have when you join the Truth Team. Help Americans find truth and live by it. Learn more by visiting pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Gary Chapman. The book is entitled The Love Languages That Matter the Most, and these are very important ones indeed. But I thought just before we talk about some other aspects of these love languages, you do go into how personality colors the conversation, and that could be the difference between introverts and extroverts, between those who are cautious and those who are curious, those who are carefree and those who are dependent, maybe even those who are cool and those who are warm. And I never really thought about that, but it's a pretty extensive chapter, which just reminds me again that even as we understand the love languages and how they're received by us, and also how they are particularly portrayed by others, that's affected by personality as well, isn't it?
It is, and that's one of the reasons I really wrote this book with Leslie Parrott. follow-up to the original 5 love languages is through the years now, and the book's been out for 30-plus years,
Yes.
people have asked me 2 questions. They say, in the book on the love languages, you mentioned that all of these love languages have dialects,
Mm-hmm.
that is, different ways of speaking them, but you don't really spell that out. What are the dialects and all that? And the other thing is that you mentioned that personality interfaces with the love languages, but you don't really explain that very well. So I'm doing that in this book.
Yeah, sure.
That's one of the 2 biggest things about this new book, The Love Language That Matters Most, because people read that title, The Love Language That Matters Most, and they say, which one is it? Which one is it? Which one is it? And in the first paragraph, we say, the love language that matters most is the love language of your partner, okay? Because so many people have read the original book,
Right.
and they get the idea, and they say, I'm gonna try this, and they speak their spouse's love language for 3 weeks, and they don't reciprocate, and they say, well, now listen, you know my love language. If you love me, you're speaking my love language. So they're really trying to manipulate the other person. They're just being selfish. But on the personality front, let's just take introvert, extrovert, for example.
Right.
So if we don't account for this, here's an example. A lady, her husband is having his 30th birthday, and so she wants to do something, really exciting about his 30th birthday. He is an introvert. She is an extrovert. So what she does, she says, I'm going to take you out to dinner tonight. I'm going to drive the car, and I'm going to surprise you. So they drive, and they eventually pull up in front of the house of a friend of theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, what are we doing here? She said, well, they want us to stop by for a few minutes. They walk in the house. There's 40 people there to celebrate his birthday.
Yeah.
Well, he's nice. He smiles and he greets everybody, and he's okay. But he really would much have preferred if she had just taken him to the restaurant and the 2 of them together could celebrate his birthday. See, she would have loved a party like that. She's doing what she thinks would make him feel loved, but she's not taking into account his personality. So on all the love languages, if you don't take into account the personality of the other person, you're going to miss the mark in your efforts to try to do something, that you think is going to really communicate to them. So that's one of the things, and one of the reasons I think this book is going to help lots and lots of people who read the original book, have the basic idea, but it's going to really help them be more effective.
Yes. And again, I would say chapter 6 is kind of worth the price alone. How personality colors the conversation. Introvert versus extrovert, cautious versus curious, carefree versus dependable, cool versus warm. Again, if you really want to begin to understand individuals, that is the case. But I left some time to at least go into the third and very significant chapter on tactics, because you take each one of those. And again, just for people that are maybe taking some notes or maybe remember that, the first one is the issue of affirmation. And you give ideas on ways to practice it, maybe times in which there would be vulnerability, maybe times of change, maybe how to give encouragement and appreciation. These are all very significant. And as you point out, it is sort of like learning a language. I know people that when I've given them affirmation, they go, oh, it doesn't matter to me. It's water off a duck's back. And if they were then to try to give affirmation to someone else, it would be like trying to learn another language, because it's so distant from their own experience that's why you have a whole chapter just trying to help people understand why it's important and how to maybe begin to learn that love language.
Yeah, and that's where the dialects come in that are going to make them much more effective. Let's just take words of affirmation, for example. That's the broad category. That's the broad language. But within that language, there's at least 3 that we talk about. One is words of encouragement, in which you are encouraging your spouse to say, you're really good at that. Maybe you ought to get a podcast going or something, because you're just good in talking to people. And you're giving them words of affirmation, but it's encouragement. But if that's not their dialect, they could feel pressured more than encouraged.
I see.
That you're trying to push them to do something they don't really want to do, And then another one is compliments. and that focuses on the person. You can be complimenting them about the way they look, or the dress they have on, or whatever, or your hair looks nice today, or anything about their personality. One of the things I like about you is your positive personality. I just love that about you. And then there is appreciation, words of appreciation, which focus on expressing your appreciation for things they are doing for you, around the house or anywhere, So they're all words of affirmation. They're just a little different in terms of, which one is more important to them than the others. So I think learning that, and you were right when you said, if you grew up in a home where you did not receive one of these languages, and you get married and find out that is the primary love language of the other person, it's going to be a learning curve. But here's the good news. You can learn any one of these when you are an adult. I remember the man who said to me, Dr. Chapman, my wife's language is words of affirmation. And I hate to say this. I don't know how to do that. I never received any positive words growing up. I was just told I was lazy. I was never going to amount to anything. And I don't know how to say positive words. And I said to him, well, you are where you are. We can't change our history. But you can learn to speak things, as an adult. So I asked him, I said, can you tell me 3 things your wife is good at? He thought a moment, and he said, well, she's a good cook, and she's a good school teacher, and she's a good mother. I wrote those 3 words down. And out beside of them, I wrote 3 sentences on each one of them. And I handed it to him. I said, now here's your assignment. This week, every day, twice a day, I want you to get in a room by yourself and read these sentences out loud so you hear yourself actually saying these words. And when you come back next week, I want you to be able to say them to me without looking at your notes. He said, well, I'll try. He came back, and he was able to do it. I said, okay, now here's your assignment. The next 3 weeks, I want you to give her one of these each week. I don't care what day of the week or time of day. But I said, now the first time you give her one of these, you may want to do it when she's looking in another direction. That is, don't look in her eyes, because that might blow your mind, And so he came back, and he had done it. And I said, okay, how'd your wife respond? He said, well, on the 3rd day, the 3rd week, she said to me, what's going on with you? I've never heard you give me so many compliments. I said, what did you say? He said, well, I just said, honey, we read that book, and I know your love language is words of affirmation, and I'm just trying to learn how to put my love into words because I do love you. She said, oh, that is so sweet.
Brother got her crying.
So,
yeah. Well, again, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I thought we'd maybe at least pick out quality time because, again, as you point out, there are different dialects there. There's improvising, managing, planning, and dreaming, and each one of these 5 love languages have their own dialects. And again, that's another just tremendous benefit of this particular one because when you talk about receiving gifts, they could be fanciful or functional or sensible or sentimental. When you talk about some of the other acts of service, you can begin to break those down into the various dialects as well. So these are just, I think, very helpful ideas. And many times there's some check boxes in some of that as well. So we'll come back and maybe talk about just maybe how to apply one more. But I do want to then get into, of course, some of the work that you've been doing in terms of maybe doing a full assessment, because then you can really break it down and understand a great deal more. So again, if you just joined us, we've been talking with, of course, our good friend, Dr. Gary Chapman, The Love Language That Matters Most, How to Personalize Love So They Really Feel It. It is available in your local bookstore, no doubt, but if you are interested, we also have a link to his website, which is very easy to find, 5lovelanguages.com. Of course, we have links on our website at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll talk a little bit more about how to maybe discern a few other dialects in one of those love languages and some comments about how to get your own assessment. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking with our good friend Gary Chapman, and I thought for just a minute we might just take on one other love language, just kind of illustrate that. And I mentioned a minute ago quality time. I think some people might say, okay, that one's kind of hard to sort through, but again, it's improvising, managing, planning, and dreaming. But it illustrates again that within any one of these love languages, there's oftentimes 3 or 4 different dialects, isn't there?
Absolutely. And on that quality time, I'll give you an example of that. Friday night, he's saying to his wife, he knows that his wife's language is quality time. And so he says to her at dinner, honey, how about tomorrow morning on Saturday? We get up early and go take a hike for all morning up at Pilot Mountain. And she said, honey, I've got Saturday already planned. He said, oh, honey, you can put those things off till next week. We'll be together all morning, honey. He thinks he's hitting a home run with her. But you see, her dialect, she loves quality time, but her dialect is planning.
Yes.
Let's put it on the calendar, honey, 2 weeks from now. I'd love to do that, but not on the spur of the moment.
Right.
But see, he's an improviser. So again, understanding the dialect is going to help you be more effective because he just knows that that's her language. So, man, she'll love this, take it all morning together. Man. So, again, that's why one of the reasons why I think this new book's going to help so many people because, if you try that sort of thing, then he probably walked away, being disappointed because he was all hyped up on this idea, of spending quality time with her and showing her how much he loves her. And then she kind of turns him down, and he just walks away. Oh man, you can't win.
Can't win.
You can't win. So understanding the dialect is going to help you win more often than perhaps you have been winning. All right.
For sure.
So, and that's true of all the gifts. Take gifts for example. Receiving gifts. You mentioned
Yes.
one of them is sensible gifts, and other fanciful gifts. There's 2 or 3 others, But this guy on the first Valentine's Day in their wedding, in their marriage, he went out and bought her a new food mixer on Valentine's Day. It was really great, And he thought, man, she's going to like this. Well, she thanked him, honey, but in her mind, she was wanting something more sentimental,
Yes.
like flowers or a card or a special dinner together,
Like giving a vacuum cleaner just doesn't connect. I understand.
So he's doing a sensible gift, but she wants a sentimental gift,
Yes. So good.
And so again, understanding these dialects is going to help people be more effective in communicating love and filling the love tank of your spouse.
Let's talk about your premium assessment because this is where you can get it very personalized. And then, as I understand, you get a 15-page report. So in some respects, digging into the details, as you have already pointed out, is going to make a lot of difference because you even think you're maybe in the right language, but you're in the wrong dialect, and sometimes it can be very frustrating for individuals that are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the premium assessment that we're talking about, Dr. Les Parrott put that together, but it's on the website, 5lovelanguages.com/premium. And it will, as you say, give you a 15-page printout, which gives you the percentages of each of the each of the languages, which one's 1, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. But in addition to that, it identifies the dialect that is most important in that particular language for you and the one that's second most important. And then it talks about your personality, it reveals your personality and talks about that. We have a lot of illustrations on that. And then you get all that information on yourself, and that your spouse does one and gets it, and you sit down and talk about this. Man, you are revealing some things that you've just learned about yourself, and you're revealing it to them.
Mm-hmm.
Man, the conversation over that is going to be very, very enlightening to couples. And we've had a great response to that already. Even before the book came out, people were taking that premium quiz. And also, a lot of counselors are using it, with their people that they're counseling. And so we're very excited about the premium quiz, and it goes with the book. I mean, the book gives you all that material itself, but this makes it personalized.
I might just mention, too, there's a store when you go to 5lovelanguages.com. Look on the store for couples. You can see the assessment and the love language books. For families, I thought I might just mention that because you also have the 5 love languages of children. You also have one called Screen Kids, which I've recommended before along with some other books because of the concerns of the fact that many of them are actually being socialized by these screens and some of the concerns that are there. And then you have even some like making things right at work to even understand how this could help you in the workplace. So it does seem to me that when people first hear about this, Dr. Chapman, they're thinking, well, this is for marriage. Well, I'm single, so it doesn't matter. Or this is for young couples, but we've been married a long time. No, that's for you too. Or maybe I'm single, but I'm in a business, but, what value is it there? Well, it's because you're going to learn some of this as well. So you have found that once you develop this in your counseling practice, it just goes out in all sorts of different directions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And, you mentioned single adults. I have a special edition for singles, just the 5 love languages for singles, that applies the concept to their relationship with their parents, their siblings, their college roommates, their dating partners, or, as you said, their work associates. And we have special editions also for parents of different things. One for blended families, one for special needs children, and so forth. So they'll find all of those if they go to 5lovelanguages.com and just check on resources, and you'll have a listing of all those.
And again, I might just mention that I'm just thrilled that you teamed up with Les and Leslie Parrott. We've certainly appreciated their work over the years, and we've appreciated seeing all of you working together in some of the different interviews, and I was hoping that we could get you on Point of View, and I'm glad we were able to do so. So as always, thank you once again for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today to talk about this on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. Always good to be with you. Keep up the good work. I appreciate what you all are doing.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, of course, we will get into some other issues on our Friday weekend edition. And I might just mention, as before, 20 million copies in print, 50 different languages, and all sorts of books that are tailored for various issues as well. Each love language has its own dialects, as we've talked about just a minute ago. And in some respects, this is a good book to put with if you already have the 5 love languages on your shelf, and I do. This would be a good follow-up because it then talks about not only those 5 love languages, but then in some cases you have 3 or 4 and sometimes 5 dialects within that are very helpful. So as we've pointed out before, whether you're married and have kids and have been working on your marriage, whether you're just dating, whether you're just getting started, whether you are maybe even empty nesters, or whether you're now caring for aged parents, whether you're, as we just pointed out a few minutes ago, find yourself in the business world and trying to understand some of the miscommunication and the inability of giving affirmation in one way or another to some of the people you work with, I think you're going to find the book very helpful. So one last time, the book came out in January. Should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if you cannot, we have information about it on our website. Simply go to pointofview.net, and I think that's all that you really need to know about that. But again, you can also go to 5lovelanguages.com. This has been another day in which we've had both Megans with us, Megan Henderson, Megan Kitchen, and it has been a delight to have them here helping the program, but I hope you will also join us tomorrow. It's our Friday weekend edition, going to be covering a lot of really important issues, and so we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.